I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to the story. You know, a few weeks ago, we told you about the plan to replace the aging Hood River Bridge across the Columbia River. It's going to be good for safety, but it does come with an increase in tolls there to help pay for the $600 million cost. Now, some of you could not help but compare the Hood River crossing to the new I-5 bridge project in Portland, which is, after all, going to cross the same river, but at a much higher price. So tonight, the tale of two bridges, a cost comparison. That's our big story. Let's start with viewer Kevin, who asked, how come it costs $600 million to build a bridge across the Columbia River in Hood River and $6 billion to build a bridge across the Columbia River in Portland? Hey, that's a great question, Kevin. Of course, the Hood River Bridge will be a lot smaller than the Interstate Bridge replacement, and Kevin acknowledged that. Hood River will be a single bridge with 2 lanes rather than 2 bridges side by side with 4 lanes each, so yeah, bigger. But still, if 2 lanes cost $600 million, then using some back of the napkin math, shouldn't 8 lanes cost about, well, 4 times as much? That would be $2.4 billion. So how do we get to 6? Well, let's dive in and take a look. We had our transportation infrastructure expert, Anthony Massouk, dig into the details and put this segment together for us. Now, for starters, that $2.4 billion estimate, it may be napkin math, but it's actually pretty dang close. Earlier this year, the Interstate Bridge replacement team released what you might call an itemized bill for the project. It breaks the $6 billion cost down into different pieces. One of those pieces was the estimated cost for the bridge replacement alone. So just the pair of new 4-lane spans across the Columbia River and their approach ramps, nothing else. The estimated cost range for that was roughly $1.6 to $2.5 billion. So the $2.4 billion napkin estimate, yeah, that kind of fits right in there at the high end of the range. It makes sense, I guess. We're buying lanes in bulk. The Hood River Bridge is longer than the I-5 bridge, so it does stand to reason that a single lane in Hood River would be maybe a bit more expensive than a single lane in Portland. The Hood River Bridge cost estimate also includes the entire project with all of the peripheral components on the north and south shores, which are relatively small. The Interstate Bridge project has its own pieces on the shores of the Columbia, but they, my friends, they are massive undertakings, and that's what pushes the price tag up to that $6 billion. You can probably guess the single biggest cost in there? Yeah, light rail. The extra width for light rail is included in the bridge's cost estimate, but everything else is a separate cost. Those costs include the tracks, 3 new stations, a new bridge to carry trains to Hayden Island, and a long viaduct to get them back down the bridge from the height on the Vancouver side. That's the part in yellow in this image. The light rail element comes to roughly $1.3 to $2 billion. That's a cost the Hood River project does not have to deal with at all. So that's a big reason it's less expensive. And then there are other upgrades on both sides of the river that contend with it here in Portland. Let's start with the Oregon side. Let's talk about the interchanges, those circular roads that you get on and off the interstate with. Well, as it's proposed right now, the Interstate Bridge replacement would include rebuilds or modifications of the North Interstate, Marine Drive, Hayden Island interchanges, as well as a replacement for the bridge that carries I-5 to Hayden Island on the Oregon side. Did you know there was a separate bridge that does that? I didn't know until today. The new Hayden Island interchange would only serve traffic from the Washington side, which, you know, would be a problem for folks driving from the Oregon side. So the project would add a new local bridge for drivers heading to the island from the Oregon mainland. It's a lot of work and steel, and it all adds up to somewhere between $1 billion and $1.6 billion. Now, the Hood River Bridge project, meanwhile, includes some upgrades on the Oregon side, but they're a lot simpler, demolishing some port buildings that are in the way and presumably rebuilding a toll booth. Back here in Portland, let's look at upgrades to the Washington side of the new bridge project. It includes rebuilding the downtown Vancouver and Highway 14 interchange, as well as modifying the Mill Plain, 4th Plain, and 39th Street interchanges. The bridge's team preferred plan calls for the new bridge to cross the river at a much higher elevation than the current structure. That takes out the need for a drawbridge, but it also means the downtown Vancouver and Highway 14 interchange in particular going to be very tall with new freeway ramps there. Add all that up and you get a range of $1 to $1.5 billion. In Hood River, the Washington side upgrades are pretty sparse. The current traffic light intersection with Highway 14 will be replaced with a traffic circle, and that's lovely and basically it. Again, the cost is already part of the project's $600 million estimate. So there you have it. Lane for lane, the Hood River Bridge and the I-5 bridge actually do have pretty similar costs. So the answer to Kevin's question, yes, we technically could build a replacement I-5 bridge for about $2.4 billion, but thrown up into $2 billion in light rail costs and up to $3 billion in freeway interchange upgrades, and you're going to wind up with a much more expensive project, which we do have now on the I-5. Which brings us to the final part of Kevin's email. It seems like the extra $3.6 billion is excessive for TriMet and lane reconfigurations. He's definitely not the only person to feel that way. All those add-on components have drawn criticism, although not all from the same places. There is, of course, the vocal segment of Clark County that would love to ditch the light rail project altogether. The rebuttal to that one, pointed out by Interstate Bridge replacement leaders, is that they hope to land around $2.5 billion in federal funding for the project, including a minimum of $1 billion from grants that the project can only get if it includes mass transit. So, yes, light rail is very expensive, but in theory, the federal government will pay for the biggest chunk of that. Other critics have taken aim at all the interchange upgrades, along with the size and the height of the bridge itself, arguing that the project is turning into a sprawling freeway expansion instead of a simple bridge replacement.
They're literally proposing to rebuild 7 interchanges between Vancouver and the three on the Oregon side of the river. And ironically, when you look at the highway costs of the project, all the elements for moving cars and trucks, it's actually the approaches and the intersections are more expensive than the bridge itself.
That is economist Joe Courtwright. He's a prominent critic of the Columbia River crossing. For those of you who are newer to the Portland area, that is the previous version of the project that fell apart in the planning stages about a decade ago. He says the current version is making the same mistakes, starting with the decision to try to build a new bridge higher up, because that means the nearby interchanges have to be higher up as well, which makes it more complicated and in turn more expensive. Courtwright also pointed to a study done all the way back in 2011 for the Columbia River crossing, which found that the 7 interchanges in the project zone are all way too close together, and that, quote, reducing and simplifying the number of interchanges would significantly improve both functionality and cost.
You would never build a freeway like that today. So first thing is, from a design standpoint, we ought to get rid of one or more of the interchanges.
Well, we asked the program administrator for the Interstate Bridge replacement about the interchange question. He said they do plan to scale down the Hayden Island interchange, but the reason all the others are included in the project is precisely because of how close they are to each other. They're basically treating the 7 interchanges as one massive interchange, reworking all of them in an effort to improve traffic flow. But that begs the question, if we can't leave any of the 7 interchanges out of the project, couldn't we improve congestion by eliminating some of them rather than upgrading all of them? Well, Johnson said the team did study that, but it turns out it's a people problem rather than an engineering issue.
One of the things that's a given in transportation, once folks have an interchange, it is very hard to remove that point of access. You know, folks for the last 60 years have had interchange connecting them. Those folks do not want to give those type of things up.
Unlike with light rail, there's no specific pot of federal money for interchanges, but Johnson argues it's all still important that they improve efficiency as much as possible, because it's going to have to compete for federal funding overall. He admits the project is trying to be one big solution to several problems at once: earthquake vulnerability, mass transit to Vancouver, congested interchanges. But he argues that in the long run, that is the best way to do it.
If you solve one problem, that you will have to come back later years at a much higher cost to try and solve the remainder of the problems in the corridor.
So what do you think about all this? Should we look at Hood River as an example in Portland, focus on the bridge itself and worry about those other things later? Or should we be doing it all at once? And just for fun, a question for you folks living in Vancouver. Would you give up your favorite I-5 interchange if it made traffic smoother? Let us know, will you? Send us an email. You can email us at thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Now to a major update on a story we've followed closely here on the show. Voters in Salem, you will get a chance to have your voice heard on that new payroll tax passed narrowly by the City Council last month. The council thought, you know, it would be much better to wait and vote in, let's say, 8 years. But enough of you said, yeah, I don't think so. So it's going to be on the November ballot this November. The referendum forcing the earlier vote qualified for the ballot last week. Just under 4,000 signatures were needed and petitioners submitted nearly 13,000. There's obviously a lot of people not pleased with that new tax, nearly 13,000 of you apparently. But why was it approved by the council in the first place? Well, city leaders say it is meant to help fill a $19 million shortfall for city services. The tax would pay for the current police force and fire department, with the other money going towards homeless services. Here's a brief rundown of what you need to know about it. Anyone who works within the city of Salem limits and makes more than minimum wage would be taxed by this payroll tax. It does not matter where you live. The tax would be 0.814%, so less than 1%, and would raise an estimated $28 million a year. Someone making roughly $62,000 a year would pay about $500 total if they worked 5 days a week in Salem. Those against it say the tax will give workers an incentive to look for a job outside of the city of Salem. They also say there's going to be big-time compliance problems for companies with hybrid workforces, since the tax only applies to days worked within the city limits. If voters uphold the tax in November, it's set to take effect next summer. But if they strike it down, then who knows? We'll be watching closely to see how city leaders react to that. Still to come on the story, we'll bring in Chief Meteorologist Matt Zaffino to answer some of your questions about this heat wave. And we'll also talk about air quality due to the wildfires, with a special behind-the-scenes look from Blair Best down in Lane County. Stick around. The story continues right after this.
All right, Pat, so we're talking bad air quality. Well, take a look behind me. This is part of the community of Mackenzie Bridge and the community of Rainbow, right outside the evacuation zone of the Lookout Fire. That's one of 2 wildfires burning here in Lane County. The other one is south of here called the Bedrock Fire. I'm sure some of that smoke is making its way into this community, but all day today it's been pretty bad. It's been pretty hard to see and breathe. At one point we had to put masks on. We were even wondering if the helicopters that drop water were even working because, I mean, just take a look at the sky here. I'll show you. It is pretty hazy. So, I mean, honestly, it's tough. It's kind of the tough part of living out here. These homes are gorgeous, their properties are gorgeous, but they just have to swallow this rough reality that the wind could change, the weather could shift, and they could lose their home. In fact, back in 2020 in the Holiday Farm fire, many people did lose their homes. That happened just a few miles down this way. Earlier today, we actually talked with a woman who lost everything. She rebuilt and is now seeing this Lookout Fire and just bracing for what could come of it.
That's a gorgeous area there. I know the famous blue hole water feature is not far from Mackenzie Bridge. Let's bring in Chief Meteorologist Matt Zaffino now to talk about air quality. We see it's bad down there in Lane County. Not great here in Metro either, eh?
No, it's not. You look outside right now from our Wells Fargo Sky Camp, Pat. You can see it's hazy out there. Not as bad as it is farther south, but we're at 102. And with the haze in the sky, look at our air quality monitors. 2 of them in the metro area are in the unhealthy category. The rest are in the moderate category, and there's unhealthy for sensitive group where that orange dot is there too. You get a little farther away, we're back in the good, and around Salem it's moderate. So it just depends on exactly where you are, but for some reason we've had a little bit of a collection of some bad air here in the Portland area, and then farther south around the fires, much worse south of Eugene, and then over in Central Oregon at Sisters and Bend. That's in the very unhealthy and hazardous category because of the drift of the smoke over the Cascades and into the valleys there over in Central Oregon. So what is going to happen next with this? Well, here's our smoke forecast, and this is called vertically integrated smoke. So it's surface smoke and the upper level smoke, and it all gets pushed away from us as we go into Thursday. Thicker smoke farther on down to the south. So we will begin to get some improvement, Pat, as we go into the next couple of days here in the Portland area, but close to those fires, even around Eugene and then across the Cascades into Central Oregon, it's going to be bad air for quite some time.
Feel for all you folks out there. That is just nasty stuff. We do have a question, Matt. John wants to know, are the sun solar flares that have recently been happening having any effect on the weather? He says, I know we are heading to a peak with flares from the sun, so we was just curious if that's been studied.
Oh, yes, that has been studied and a lot. And John is right. We are heading into what is called the solar maximum. There's an 11-year cycle with the sun where you get a lot of activity and then a minimum and then a lot of activity. And that cycle goes every 7 years. So, yes, the sun has been active. Now, we're going to do something, Pat, that I've always wanted to do on this story. Calculus. Just kidding. We're really not going to do it, but I'm showing you the Stefan Boltzmann law because this shows the relationship between radiant heat and temperature. It's basically proportional to the 4th power of the temperature. That's as much calculus as we are going to do. Luckily, the folks at NASA have boiled this down into a graph that shows the relationship between the Earth's temperature and solar activity. So let's zoom in on this a little bit, and it goes up until 2021. So time going from left to right, and then from the bottom of the screen and up is what we call total solar irradiance in watts per meter squared. That's basically the power of the sun, how much energy we're getting from the sun, right? That, of course, is the yellow line. Our Earth's temperature is the red line, and you can see they don't really track. The thick lines here are 11-year averages. 11 years is used to try to reduce some of the noise from the signal because the sun is on that 11-year cycle that I told you about. And then the thin lines are the annual variations here. But look what happens. You see the solar activity going down over the last several decades, while the Earth's temperature has been steadily going up. So the relationship has been studied, and there's really very little relationship between solar activity and the Earth's temperature. Now, when we get a solar maximum, we may see a little bit of an increase, a little bit of a contribution, like 0.05 degrees Celsius to maybe 0.1, whereas the contribution from human-caused global warming has been an accumulating 0.2 degrees Celsius over the last several decades here. So you can see the contribution from climate change way outstrips the contribution that we get when we get a little bit of an uptick in solar activity. So this has been studied by lots of scientists for a very, very long time, but it is a great question, but the answer is basically really very little contribution, Pat.
Thanks, Matt. I always learn great stuff here, and thanks for sparing us most of the part on the calculus.
You bet.
I'm a proud English major. Thank you very much.
You got it.
Still ahead on the story, our team at KGW recently said farewell to a longtime colleague of ours who's retired after more than 4 decades of storytelling. You'll certainly recognize the name and the voice. We'll take a moment to celebrate him here on The Story when we come back. Here at KGW, we recently said goodbye and happy retirement to one of our longtime photojournalists. Stephen Redlin spent more than 40 years in the news business before retiring last week. You've seen his stories many times over the years here on The Story. He started as a news photographer, but during the pandemic, he started adding in his own unique voice, bringing you stories of interesting people and projects across the Northwest. He even won an Emmy for it last year. Congratulations. Here's part of our tribute video that we played for Stephen as we celebrated the end of his career.
We're going to begin with the adrenaline rush, covering something we've all come to know as breaking news.
What is the word that comes to mind when you think of Steve? Intense, or intensity. He even had that in his locker for a while.
Let's see here.
I guess you could say intense. I just thought he was very focused on what he was trying to do.
Motivated and able to really focus on what he's doing.
It is, definitely. You're always working under boundaries. There we go.
Just a real sincere guy. You look and you find something new, and sometimes it gets a little like you've done it before.
Definitely Steve liked the banana on the riper side, like really ripe. Like I could pull a banana out of my backpack that had been there too long. It's really nasty. And Steve, oh yeah, that's great.
Definitely a fan of the vintage banana. You're right. To this day, Carla and I will talk about, oh, that banana's about ready to meet its just rewards. And she's like, well, why don't you take it down and give it to Steve?
Very impressed with Steve, how he reinvented himself during COVID.
Chef Michael Casper is passionate about food, cooking, and community.
Just not just being a photog storyteller, but then actually ended up becoming a very good writer and producing really good stories. I really admire Steve for that.
I'm Stephen Redlin.
Thank you.
Yeah. KGW News.
We're going to miss him. Enjoy retirement. That's the end of our show. Thanks for watching, and remember the story, our collective story, that never ends. Stick around now for the good stuff coming your way next, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow at 6:30.